So as far as installing a carburetor goes, there's not a whole lot that goes into it. You want to attach all your parts and pieces like your fuel rail here before you install your carburetor. It makes it a little bit easier. And also, if you're making adjustments like your squirt nozzles here, I recommend doing those with the carburetor off, as they have little O-rings that can fall down in there, and you really don't want those going through the engine. So, you know, really there's not a whole lot to be done. Obviously, you'd want to have your studs installed here and have those all to where they should be and the right height. On here I'm running a carburetor spacer. I always recommend running those, as it helps velocity through the carburetor, especially these 4-hole spacers. And you also want to have a fresh gasket. It's far too easy to get a vacuum leak, so you might as well invest your money well into a new gasket before you go ahead and install your carburetor. So I'm going to slap it on here, and keep in mind that when you install a carburetor, you want to make sure with the fuel rail nothing's binding up or a tight squeeze, and you want to keep your fuel lines as far away from heat as you possibly can, so if you can avoid them setting on the manifold or sitting on the valve covers, that's always a good idea. And you always want to run as much metal fuel line as possible. Now, I had a temporary setup on here over the fall, so as you can see I got some rubber line, but I don't recommend doing it that way. So anyway, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and set the carburetor on. Okay, so when you go to set the carburetor on, it's not really all too difficult. You definitely need 2 hands. You want to see, I got some spark plug wires in the way here. Get those out of the way. And more or less, it's just as easy as setting it on there. Now what you want to do is you want to make sure before you ever go to fire it is that you have all your throttle cables hooked up the way you're supposed to, your transmission kickdowns, which I don't have because I'm running a manual, and all your choke components. But your biggest thing is you want to make sure you have your fuel hooked up, especially if you run a mechanical pump, because you can imagine it'd be pretty catastrophic to be dumping fuel all over the intake manifold, which would take your paint off and most likely start a fire. But anywho, you want to, if anything, you want to make sure you have that hooked on. And I recommend that when you put your nuts onto your carburetor here, onto your studs, first of all, you want to make sure you have enough thread to get the nut all the way down on. But what I also recommend is using obviously a washer and then locking nuts, because I've had several instances where when the temperature changes, they'll come loose. I'll actually have a vacuum leak at the base of the carburetor. So you want to have those tightened down pretty good, but not too tight. But it's definitely important. If you tighten them down too tight, what you'll do is you'll warp your base of your carburetor there, and you'll have a big vacuum leak as well. So you don't want to do that, but within reason, you want to have them tightened down. Use locking nuts so they can't come loose. That's your best bet. But obviously, you'd hook everything up in your return spring, and which is very important as well. You always want to be sure to use a double return spring if you can help it. So for safety's sake, you don't want to run your investment into a wall. But anywho, that's pretty much it as far as installing a carburetor. If you have an electric fuel pump, before you go to start your car, you can flip your switch on and fill your bowls up, or as I like to do with my mechanical stuff here in this vehicle, is I just get a little syringe deal and dump fuel into my vent tubes. But anywho, that's about it. And you want to make sure you install this rod when your carburetor is off, just in case you may drop a nut or something down in the bores of the carburetor. You really don't want to drop anything into the manifold. So anywho, that's how that's done. I also wanted to mention really quick that when you install your spring, that it doesn't bind up. It's really important that it doesn't have any spot where it catches on the linkage and binds. So you want to work your throttle all the way wide open and make sure that it clears, because again, you don't want to get stuck in a partial throttle or full throttle situation. And I made this little bracket just for the heck of it. I had it wired back so it wouldn't spin loose, but you always want, with your spring, if you're not mounted to the manifold, you want to mount it to something that has more than one mounting point of contact, because see, this would be on here and it could easily rotate, and then I would have no spring tension either, and it wouldn't do anything. So that's something else to be aware of when you're installing your carburetor. Your spring is very important. So there you have it. Okay, so removing a carburetor really isn't all that difficult. What you want to make sure is that you have all your linkages removed, and you know those vary by make and model, but basically you want to have all that removed before you go and try and take the carburetor off, obviously, like this throttle linkage there. What I like to do on my electric fuel pump vehicles is I like to shut the pump off and actually run all the fuel out of the bowls and kind of let it idle, maybe rev it up a little bit. You know, anything where I can empty the fuel out of the bowls so that it doesn't dump all over the place when I try and take the carburetor off. With these that are mechanical pumps, I mean, hypothetically, I guess you could take your fuel line and run it into a jug and run the vehicle and do the same dance, but you know, that's kind of a hassle. So generally I just go ahead and remove the carburetor anyway with the fuel in the bowl. And what I like to do is while the carburetor is still held on so it can't really dance around on you a whole ton, is obviously you'd remove your fuel line here and a little fuel will drip out, but not a whole lot. I like to keep a rag under where I'm disconnecting the line from so that it doesn't run all over the paint, because it'll take your paint right off. And what I like to do is cap this fuel line here. You know, this is 3/8 hose, and I'll just take some 3/8 hose and put a bolt in it and shove it on over there, and that ought to cap it off. And then from there I go ahead and just take the bolts out. And if you have washers on here like I do, I recommend that you, oops, dropped it onto the intake manifold there. I recommend that you remove these washers, because what could happen when you go and take the carburetor off is they could drop into the intake manifold. So, and that's really not what you want. So I'm going to go ahead and get all these removed, and then I'll pull the carburetor off here. Okay, so I got everything unhooked here, and really you're pretty ready to lift the carburetor right up and out. And again, make sure you cap this fuel line or have a rag under it at least, because it will ruin some stuff. So as far as paint finishes and stuff goes, but if your wires are in the way, you know, you can always take your cap off and get those out of the way, but this one ought to slink out pretty easily. But you just basically simply lift it on or off and rotate it out of the way there. You definitely don't want to drop it or scratch up this base plate. So if you can avoid rubbing it against the studs, that's pretty much your best bet. So anywho, that's pretty much how that's done. So basically at this point, when your carburetor's off and you're doing whatever it is you're doing, depending on how long you're going to have your carburetor off, I always believe it to be pretty good practice to take anything, a clean rag or cloth, and stick something down into your carburetor bores here into your manifold so you don't drop a bunch of crap in. I like to remove my carburetors over winter so they don't lacquer up with fuel. I've always thought this to be good practice. And what I like to do is spray either fogging oil or WD-40, you know, a liberal amount down the bowl vent tubes. So we'll go show that really quick, what I'm talking about again. So here's the vent tubes. And you want to, first, if you didn't empty your fuel out, you want to empty your fuel out either by turning your carburetor upside down and it'll run out your vent tubes, and then by working your linkage here, and then it'll take it all out of the squirt system, or the the accelerator pump system. There we go. But anyway, I like to empty all the fuel out and then put fogging oil or WD-40 down into my bowl vents, so that gets into the bowls and kind of protects all the diaphragms from drying out and what have you, and prevents lacquered gas from getting in there and building up. So I like to do that on carburetors that I let sit on the shelf for a long period of time. It keeps them in pretty good shape, I've noticed. But basically that's it. And when you would go to install another carburetor, you would obviously need a new carb gasket. So anyway, I do not believe in reusing carburetor gaskets, so you always want to use new. Obviously, when you run a spacer like I do, which again, I highly recommend, as it keeps your carburetor real cool and your fuel dense, so it leads to a much stronger mixture. But you want to, if you have a spacer like this, you want to make sure you replace the bottom gasket and the top gasket, so both of those need to be replaced. So anywho, and this is how I usually store my car over the winter, and I usually suck all the fuel out of my gas tank as well. But anywho, there you have it, how to remove a carburetor.